Hi there. In this lecture we see Abraham Kupchik against Capablanca in the 1926 late Hopatcong tournament round 2. So we see d4, Capablanca plays knight f6, knight f3, e6, e3, b6. So this is Queen's Indian style from black here. Bishop d3, bishop b7. So Capablanca is perhaps influenced by the hypermoderns influencing the e4 square, not actually committing to d5 just yet. After white castles, now knight e4 is played, knight bd2, and now f5. So this is kind of an exotic opening by Capablanca. We see c3. Perhaps this is slightly more passive than c4. c4 is slightly more aggressive here. So if c4 had been played, we could have, for example, bishop e7. One perk here. I mean, this is a constant danger for black. d5, you know, black has to be aware of the possibility of d5 at some point. So, for example, queen c2, knight takes d2, bishop takes d2. If black plays bishop takes f3, this position is actually rather nice for white. Overall, it's okay. So that is an interesting move, just to play c4. Also, let's examine just for the record here, knight takes e4. Is this entirely silly? It's not entirely silly if white did this because of knight e5. If here e takes d3, queen h5 check, g6, knight takes g6, this is interesting. For example, here, queen g5 check is going to be an equal position, something to be aware of. But in this case, black can play d6. After queen h5 check, g6, knight takes, h takes, this position is going to be better for black. So yes, there is a problem there with taking on e4 with the knight. If bishop takes e4, f takes, knight e5, queen h4 is good here to stop all this queen h5 business. And this situation, for example here, is going to be fine for black. Okay, so in the game, c3, back to the game, bishop e7, queen c2, and now d5, which does give a hole on e5, but we see that this hole doesn't seem that dangerous for black. Actually, it's occupied here. Capablanca castles f3, knight takes d2, bishop takes d2, and now knight d7. It really doesn't seem that dangerous. So it's as if Capablanca is playing a kind of Dutch defense here, and in the Dutch defense, this bishop is supposed to be bad, but actually here it seems to be okay for the moment, eyeing the e4 square, helping control e4. We have knight takes d7. If f4, knight takes e5, f takes c5, this is an even position. So knight takes d7, so much for the e5 square. Queen takes d7, rook a e1, and now c5, queen d1. You might think white's playing rather, passively, but if, for example, e4, this doesn't really help matters. F takes here, and then C takes, and that D pawn's going to be weak. For example, this situation is going to be a disaster for white. For example, like this, with bishop h4 check here, and then bishop g5, it's becoming a disaster. Black's going to be winning material. So it's too ambitious to actually play e4, if we look at this. So yeah, this situation, if we look at it once more, so C takes, say e5, this... Okay, it looks at h7, but actually black can afford this, it seems, and should be okay here at least. So this position, black should be okay. Or if we follow it for a bit more, black should have a small edge at least. So, okay, queen d1 is played, and we have rook f6, and it seems Capablanca is going on to the attack here. Queen e2, rook a f8, bishop b5. Now, perhaps c4 here is interesting. If we look at this, bishop d6, rook f2, queen c7, that looks at h2. If g3, h6, king h1, black can actually just clamp against g4 here. And if we look at this position, it should be okay for black. If rook 8 to f7, let's just have a quick look at the scene here. Black should be okay in this kind of scenario as well. So, okay, with maybe even a small edge. So bishop b5 was played here, though. And this is actually, it's not that great because it could be a tempo target later with a6 if the queen's not supporting the bishop. We have queen c7 and now f4. So the funny thing is about this position, it's like the e4 break has been bypassed. There's no e4 break, but it does mean that actually maybe g4 is a break to look out for later. And if white's pawn breaks can be kind of extinguished, then maybe, you know, in theory, if the queen's not eyeing a6, you know, this kind of attack could be really dangerous on the queen side. We see, you know, this is very, very interesting to play f4. If bishop d3, c4, bishop c2, black could play e5 actually. This is quite an interesting move. If e4, d takes, f4, and this leaves black with actually a very interesting attacking situation. Even if black loses a pawn here, this is quite a bind against the white position. It's something to bear in mind in similar positions if you ever get similar positions. So this kind of thing where we're sitting on the e5 square, the bishops, you know, are great. Black should have a small edge overall. It's pretty dynamic stuff. If we look at this again, if bishop b1, e5, we can even play for e4 and have a very aggressive pawn chain. And in this scenario, yeah, black could actually play very attackingly on the king's side, potentially. Black should be with the advantage there. So anyway, f4, though, was played, quite committal, c4. And we see now that actually Capablanca has this accelerated idea of playing for the b4 plan. King h1, bishop d6 first, though. Rook f3, and now h5. And you might think, why isn't Capablanca getting along with things with a6 and b5? This is designed, this heavy prophylaxis against g4. And this does remind me of, you know, the art of war principle. The good fighter puts themselves beyond defeat before going on to the attack. Here in this game, it looks as though, you know, the important strategic pawn breaks are being locked down, and pretty emphatically for any potential g4 here. Yeah, this is quite fascinating. If g4 can be locked down, then black can really get on with the queenside play without any, you know, worry, basically. You know, it's like going shopping, locking the car, and then going shopping. You know, you don't have less worries about the car, in theory. You've reduced risk. So here, it's like a risk reduction prophylaxis, you know, Petrosian style game, actually, here, where he'd extinguish any risks of losing first before being adventurous. If a6 instead, if we look at this, and we look at the g4 break in action, let's say h5 though thrown in to stop g4, white could still end up trying to play for g4 in some cases. For example here, h3. So this is quite an extreme example where actually if g4 happens, just to illustrate, it ends up being about even the position. You can see that white has some dynamic play here, and this is where the king lives as well. So that's why g4 is a break of serious concern to try and lock down, if we can lock down the g4 break, because it will liberate pieces and potentially weaken our king. So it's very, very interesting prophylaxis here, h5, and it continues with rook h6. So really, it's like, you know, Petrosian style mysterious rook move, just to stop, you know, g4, bishop e1, g6, bishop h4, king f7, and the king's kind of evacuating in advance. Queen e1, a6, bishop a4, b5, bishop d1. Now bishop c6. This does support potentially a real undermining operation if the bishop is supporting a4. Then a4, a3, and we've got a real undermine operation here. If a5 immediately, you know, this position should also be okay. We can do that move order. But bishop c6 first, rook h3, a5, bishop g5, the rook goes to h8, queen h4, b4, queen e1. Yeah, white's without really much of a plan here. And, you know, the rook is in front of the h-pawn. Without any g4 here, white's just waiting for this undermining plan, it seems. So rook hf3, a4, supported by the bishop on c6. So this really is the art of war principle brought to life on the chessboard. You know, if you can nullify the opponent's counterplay totally in advance, not have to worry about any pawn break like e4 or g4 and have this undermining for free, so to speak, then that's great. And the undermining continues, so white's pawn chain is being hit. We have b3, and there are consequences here. If b takes, it fragments white's pawns, and they isolated pawns like this tend to fall off like ripe apples. So, for example, queen a7. How is white stopping black winning one of the a pawns? And when this happens, the queenside counterplay can be quite ferocious. Say h4 here, and this is getting dangerous tactically. The queen's going to be overloaded, can't really take there without losing material to rook takes d3 and rook takes h4. So this one again stop g4. There'll even be en passants available, and this position just looks, it will be desperate. There's no entry points here on the e file anyway, even if e4 is played tactically. For example, here this is just crushing. So that's a great positional scenario. B takes a3, what will happen? So in fact, in the game, b3 is played. But of course, this weakens c3. So we have c takes b3, bishop takes b3, bishop b5, which is a double attack now, hitting the rook and also unveiling an attack on c3. White is actually losing material now. Queen takes c3, queen takes, b takes. Yeah, a strong pass pawn there. Rook hc8, bishop h4, bishop d3, trying to drive away the blockade. And here already there's a great tactical combination to finish here. So what would you play for 100 points? A beautiful positional game of prophylaxis. I think Petrosian would be proud. Petrosian would be influenced by this sort of game. Rook takes b3. It's all about the pass pawns now. A takes a2. White resigns here. So why did white resign? If bishop e1, we can play bishop b4. And we're threatening bishop b1 basically, which would disconnect the rook from a1. So say bishop takes c3, we can play rook takes c3, and this is just desperate. We're going to be winning the other rook soon. So, what does white actually do? If h3, bishop b1, this position is just completely, lost, the bishop down. So yes, an interesting positional game. It was very, prophylaxis driven to extinguish any kind of worries in advance before going on to the attack, which the attack was queenside operations, undermining operations, which ended up winning material on the queenside. So a great game with minimal counterplay basically. I hope you enjoyed this one, pretty instructive. Thanks so much.